This is Deviance, which is chapter 6, and this is part 2 of the lecture. So we ended on looking at the social construction of deviance as applied to sexual deviance and sexual norms. Now we are moving on to theory. And I know you guys are like, oh no, not theory again, but it's actually a lot more palatable in this format. So structural functionalism. Now you remember what I told you guys, that structural functionalism is largely rejected in modern sociology simply because it is kind of assuming this unanimity that isn't actually there, especially when it comes to a capitalist society where the focus is on individuality and personal liberty and happiness, right? So from a structural functionalist point of view, the argument is that deviance plays a function in stabilizing society using these two things. The first is that it clarifies moral boundaries, right? So when there is an instance of deviance, then it allows the rest of us to go, you know what, this just happened, it's definitely wrong. The second item is that structural functionalism argues that solidarity is formed from deviance because we're united in outrage. Now, going back to this idea that it doesn't really work in modern society, especially in US society, we can actually poke holes in this theory just even looking at what's happened within the last couple of weeks, right? Obviously, the entire nation then has moved to social distancing, that we have a virus that is incredibly contagious, and we've been asked then to basically stay at home, not go out, not interact with people as much. And what we saw were the reactions were very, very mixed. You had people who actually obeyed orders instantaneously and said, okay, this is my part in the effort, I need to stay home. You had people then actually laughing at the guidelines and continuing to defy them by going out. I was actually really shocked that the weekend after MCC shut down its classes, there were so many posts on social media of people going to the bars or going to the movies or basically going out and socializing. On the other hand, we also saw people basically run out to the stores and hoard all of our valuable resources, leaving none for anyone else. So we can actually say when it comes to structural functionalism, it's not really that valid because we are looking at deviance from the norm. This is not a regular phenomenon for the United States. And instead of clarifying these boundaries, it actually added and created more questions. And instead of uniting us in outrage, I think overall from a macro level, we see that the responses then range pretty drastically. Okay, so that is structural functionalism. I didn't spend that much time on it simply because, like I said before, not quite as used in modern sociology. So slide 10 in the basic PowerPoint is conflict theory. And once again, we approach the term that you guys have learned over and over in this course, and that is the concept of hegemony. So with conflict theory, we're always looking at this idea of a power imbalance, about power and oppression. And so with the hegemonic model of deviance, basically what we maintain is that inequalities of wealth and power are present in our definitions of deviance. Okay, that is, our laws then may look like they are non-biased. They look like they're written so that they would apply to everyone. However, when we look at the enforcement of these laws, what we can see is that a lot of times they're used to target certain populations. Okay, so what happens is that those who are at top then are subject to different rules, and the behaviors of less powerful groups are more likely to be criminalized. Okay. Oh, I give you guys two examples for this one. The first one is a court case called Lawrence v. Texas, and this happened in 2003. So at the time in Texas, there was on the books something called an anti-sodomy law. That an anti-sodomy law basically deems all sexual acts outside of heterosexual vaginal penetration as illegal. So oral sex, illegal, right? Anal sex, illegal. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, how on earth do you enforce that one? That doesn't even make any sense. Well, unfortunately, it was written in a way that supposedly looks like, oh, well, this applies to everyone. Instead, what happened was this. If you are a heterosexual couple, very few people have insight into what is going on in your sexual life, right? If you are gay, and especially back in 2003 in Texas, if you are gay, you are actually subject to a lot more scrutiny than everyone else. Okay. So what happened with Lawrence v. Texas is the following. That is, Lawrence was a gay man. His neighbors didn't really want him living in their apartment complex. So he actually brought a man to his home one night, and his neighbors reported him and basically filed some false claims, basically saying, oh, we think that there's weapons in there, something suspicious is going on, you need to go in and check on him. When the police entered his apartment, they actually found Lawrence having sex with a man he had invited into his apartment, and they were both charged with this anti-sodomy law, and basically had to go through the criminal justice system for it. Lawrence then sued. He basically sued and said, you know what, this can't be right. This is not okay. The Supreme Court then later actually ruled anti-sodomy laws unconstitutional. Now, what I find very fascinating is that the U.S. Military Code of Justice also had an anti-sodomy law, and the way that it is written in the U.S. Military Code of Justice, and you guys can go look it up. I think it was Article 125. Is that it basically said any type of sex besides vaginal penetration is not okay. And they immediately jumped to bestiality after that, which didn't make any sense at all. That was also removed from the books, but it wasn't until fairly recently that it did so. So what you see is that people can make the argument, okay, well, this law it doesn't say anything about gay people in there, right? But what you can see is the way that it's enforced. You can pretty much target certain groups with a law that is written fairly neutrally. Okay. The other example that I give you guys is Reinerman's social construction of drug scares. Okay. When I lectured about conflict theory, I taught you a little bit about how drug scares are used to control groups of people. If you remember, we did talk about how laws against weed then were actually used to keep certain groups then under control. So what Reinerman did in 1994, his research method was content analysis. Content analysis is a form of research that examines existing documents such as the news, such as media releases, to explore whatever concept you are trying to study. And so Reinerman's hypothesis was pretty much what I presented when we talked about conflict theory, is that drug laws were not so much about the actual drug that was involved. Instead, they are a way then to control a population that is already limited in power. So what happens in the case? What does Reinerman argue? Well, with any drug scare, any drug law, there is a kernel of truth into the argument that is being made. However, the drug then is associated with a group of people, and social policies and media magnification just kind of allows then the U.S. government, and has allowed the U.S. government, to wield drug laws against certain populations. So the easiest one to kind of illustrate this is the first immigrant group that came to the United States in droves, and now are actually considered white people, right? And that is the Irish. Now, what happened with anti-Irish immigration? What we find is that America is not very creative when it comes to the things they claim about groups with little power. That is the same, the same arguments against immigration and immigrants have been used throughout U.S. history. That is, the narrative's always two things. The first is immigrants steal American jobs, right? The second then is that immigrants cause an increase in crime. Now, even though sociological research actually shows that the opposite of this is true, the narrative still stays to to spread anti-immigrant sentiment, right? We can think of this most recently in the past couple of years with the caravan of refugees from Central America kind of walking up to the United States to seek refuge. Even though it was largely women and children who were fleeing violence, then they were basically cast as drug smugglers or criminals, even though it was a false narrative. Okay. So the primary difference between drug use between the wealthy and the oppressed is not that the wealthy use it less, right? In some cases, you're going to say, well, the wealthy actually have more money to spend on recreational drugs. Instead, the wealthy actually have the resources, they have the space to keep their drug use private. They don't have to do it out in public. That is, if you are poor, you are less likely to have a very big space in order to congregate and, do drugs, right? And so when it came to prohibition, which is the way that America used to control the Irish, it wasn't that the Anglos at the time were not drinking. They were still drinking. But they had the resources, the mechanisms to do it in private, to do it in a very elitist way. Generally, oppressed groups are more exposed to the public because they tend to have less money. And the main thing is that because these laws were written in a way that they could be wielded against groups, they're already being scrutinized. They are already then under a lot of attention for being a group that uses these drugs. Okay. So like I said, alcohol laws were used to control Irish immigrants in the 1920s. That we already talked about the marijuana laws. The fact that we don't even have them written down on the books using their Latin names. Like we don't say cannabis, right? We don't say cannabis sativa or cannabis indica. Instead, we use the Spanish word from Mexico to call it marijuana laws, right? Once again, you see then how that already then oppresses a group that's already oppressed. We're not going to call it by its, Latin name. Instead, we're going to attach it to Mexican immigrants. Later, weed laws were used to control anti-war protesters in the 1960s. Now, the biggest example that we have of this inequality and of how people are oppressed through drug laws has to do with the 1980s and the war on drugs. That laws against crack then were actually used to control and mass incarcerate Black Americans starting in the 1970s. It kind of really, really hit in the 1980s. Okay. Now, if you've watched any movies about Wall Street from the 80s, what you realize is the wealthy, their drug of choice, what was glamorized throughout the media, was powdered cocaine use. In fact, if you watch movies like Wall Street or American Psycho, etc., the use of cocaine then really widespread. It almost seemed normalized. What happened in that case is that crack cocaine, powdered cocaine, people argue with me that there is a substantive difference. I'm going to argue that maybe crack is a little bit worse, but it is not 9 times worse than powdered cocaine. But what you found is that federal law actually penalized crack cocaine 9 times harsher than they did powdered cocaine, which resulted then in a lot of arrests of people who were selling or using crack at the time. Now, later, the Supreme Court actually argued that these drug laws against crack were unconstitutional, right? And if you look at that, basically American courts said, yes, we are actually using these drugs to oppress a powerless group. So in that case, you see how conflict theory works in terms of social control, in terms of favoring the wealthy and elite, and how it essentially then allows America to demonize certain populations through then the use of drug laws. Okay. So those are the two macro theories when it comes to deviance. I am going to stop here to take a break, and then I will continue lecturing in part 3 on the symbolic interactionist theories of deviance. Okay, okay. See you then.